Hi class, Professor Seeger here. In this video I will be going over an important criticism that we will revisit in this course called post-colonialism. This criticism will be a metaphorical lens that will help us understand the complex web of identity and culture that most post-colonial cultures experience. At this point in the program, please remove yourself from all distractions. Make sure you have a pen and pad of paper to take notes during the presentation. If I go too quickly, please feel free to stop and rewind as often as you need to. One of the most important concepts of post-colonialism is to examine the transformation of those of the native culture into a thing called the other. This means that the native culture is different than the dominant culture, and it is implied that this othered culture is less valuable, less civilized, and less human than the dominant colonial culture. The best way I know to explain this concept is to paraphrase George Orwell in Animal Farm. All animals, people, are created equal, but some are more equal than others. Consider the depictions of the two sides of this image. What images differentiate the native culture? What associations do our Western culture place on those images of shields and spears, as opposed to red coats with rifles? Colonialism happens when a strong nation takes over or colonizes a weaker one. This is almost always done with brute force in order to acquire extra markets, resources, and or manpower for the colonies. In their readings of colonial and post-colonial literature, post-colonial critics rely heavily on other available literary theories. They manipulated Marxism, New Historicism, psychoanalysis, and deconstructionism to help them understand the complexity of the effects of colonialism to the identity and overall life of the native culture. However, when the colonizers, usually European, exploit this weaker nation, they maintain a moral high ground by arguing that they have altruistic motivation to save the natives' culture in the following ways. 1. The colonized are savages in need of education and rehabilitation. Often, this rehabilitation was violent, or at the very least, natives were taught to have contempt for their native culture. 2. The native culture is not up to the standard of the colonizer, and it's the moral duty of the colonizer to save the natives. This, of course, led to such horrific slaughters such as the Spanish Inquisition in Mexico and the continued treatment of Native Americans here in the United States. 3. The colonized nation is unable to manage and run itself properly, and thus it needs the wisdom and expertise of the colonizer. In fact, in American and European literature there is a common trope known as the white savior, in which a native culture is struggling, and it takes a white westerner to teach them a new way. Think of movies like Dances with Wolves or Avatar. These may seem like progressive films on the surface, but the subtle message most often seems to be that native cultures need to be colonized. 4. The native culture embraces a set of religious beliefs incompatible with those of the colonizer, and it is God's given duty of the colonizer to bring those stray people to the right path. This often leads to the colonizer sacrificing the body of the native for the sake of this religious conversion. 5. The colonized people pose dangerous threats to themselves and to the civilized world if left alone. It is in the interest of the civilized world to bring these people under control. As a result of this forced colonization, the Europeans ventured adventurously into the so-called underdeveloped countries of Africa, the Americas, and Asia, and they dominated a lot of geographical spaces there. They subjugated the natives and imposed their colonial will on them. They eroded the natives' cultures and languages, plundered the natives' wealth, and established their orders based on settler supremacy. These are general tendencies that were constantly repeated, no matter the colonizing agent. The details may be different, but really not that different. The Spanish Inquisition made it a mission to subjugate and eradicate Aztec culture as a noble pursuit. At the same time, they stole and mined all the Aztecs' gold and other resources. Many natives were killed in the name of the church. Also, keep in mind that one of those resources were slaves. Nations become post-colonial when the overt and violent oppression is over, with the colonizer as the victor, and the majority of the native population has accepted the colonial rule as, if not beneficial, then inevitable. Of course, the extent of this colonial oppression varies depending on the colonial force, which is usually English, Spanish, or French, and it depends on the nation being occupied. While defending its position against colonialism and imperialism, postcolonialism in literature and the arts assumes the following. 1. Cultural relativism. This means that the colonists' defilement of native culture is socially, morally, and politically incorrect. 2. The absurdity of colonial language and discourses. A careful study of recent colonial narratives like Passage to India and Heart of Darkness suggests that the colonialist is at a loss, due to language and experience, to comprehend, fathom, and express his colonial experience. 3. Ambivalence towards authority. This ambivalence is born out of the struggle and conflict between native and settler, with the outcome of the settler's disposal. This victory over the settler leads the native to question all forms of authority. 4. Colonial alienation. Colonialism leads to the alienation of the native in his own land. This is described as a traumatic experience that erodes the individual's identity. Oppression is a basic ingredient of colonialism. There is no denying that oppression dehumanizes both the oppressor and the oppressed. Thus, in the thickness of colonialism, national movements, most of them radical and violent in their approaches, emerged to counter the aggression of colonialism. Some of the results and effects are 1. The total or partial erosion of the colonized culture. 2. The total rejection by some elements among the colonized of everything Western as a form of reaction and protest against the colonizer. 3. The categorization of the world into ranks, such as First World, Second World, the Western world, and the rest with all the subsequent stereotyping and prototyping that follows. 4. The emergence of different forms of fundamentalism that aim at purifying their local cultures from the residues of the colonial past. 5. The emergence of the bourgeois class in the colonies, modeling themselves after their masters, who endeavor to maintain their status quo by getting closer to Western culture. 6. The emergence of societies with a lot of contradictions and split loyalties. So there are a lot of political and identity issues involved with post-colonial criticism, but you are probably asking how literature plays into things. Good question. Colonial literature works to both indoctrinate and other those from a native culture. Literature does this by creating this thing called a literary canon. It is not an actual weapon, but a collection of the great works of literature that the educated people of that culture are expected to know and read. In colonial cultures, typically, until very recently, these works were written by rich white men. So this affects native cultures in two ways. First, these works of literature do not represent people of that native culture, or if they do, they are represented in negative ways. Second, it is difficult for native cultures to identify with these texts because of not only language barriers, but most of the references are foreign to them in terms of religion, political systems, cultural allusions, as well as references to strange species of animals and plants. Think of it this way. A Shakespearean play is already difficult for most Americans to read because of dated references and language. Now imagine how much more difficult understanding the play would be when all of those allusions are completely foreign, and all the plant and animal references were completely foreign. We know what a rose represents in our culture, but what about places where roses are not native? Much of the literature we'll be reading in this class will be from the perspective of poets living in a post-colonial nation, who find it vital to create a literature that works to navigate their complex post-colonial world. As a post-colonial critic, you will be reading texts with the following questions in mind. So write them down. 1. What is the author's social position in their post-colonial society? Are they the colonizer or colonized? How do they react to the colonial culture? 2. How do these narratives treat their subjects that are colonial or native or some combination of both? It is also important here to consider the author and their history. 3. Track down the process of identity growth or degeneration in the characters of the narratives. Point out the causes of such growth or degeneration. 4. Consider the stereotypes presented in the narratives. What are they? How are they presented? For example, are the local inhabitants seen as savages, cannibals, polygamous, dirty, violent, irrational? 5. What binary opposition does the text present? Are there natives versus settlers? Assimilated natives versus fundamental natives? In what ways are they in opposition? 6. What cultural elements and stereotypes are being examined, and how are they presented? What is the tone? Biased, level-headed, objective, or neutral? To what effect? Questions are vital. It is when we accept things at face value that we turn a blind eye to the various strings of oppression that tug at us. It is easy to get entrenched in our own culture and its virtues. Compared to our deeply entrenched beliefs and ways of thinking, every other culture is going to seem strange or weird or scary. Keep in mind that the beliefs of other cultures are just as deeply felt and just as intricately interwoven into their lives and their ways of understanding that world. When they are violently told that those beliefs are dangerous and must change or else, there are many physical, emotional, and psychological implications. It is important that you ask questions that seek to expose these differences. These questions will hopefully reorient you and your place in the world as not the center, but perhaps one square in a quilt of different cultures, beliefs, and ways of thinking. Also remember that we do not have to reserve these questions to literary texts. We can look at television and movies in the same way. We can ask these questions of events in our everyday lives. In this way, everything we experience is worthy of analysis.